We're going to be making 3 blocks this month. The first one is the Octagons Block. And in your kit, you have what the pattern is calling a beige print, a red print, and 4 blue prints. From the beige print, we're cutting 5 2.5-inch squares. So the way I'm going to do that is start by clean cutting 2 edges, and then I'm going to cut a 2.5 by 12.5-inch rectangle. So I'm going to line my 2.5-inch mark up on the long straight edge and my 12.5-inch mark up on the short edge that I just clean cut. So 12.5 and 2.5 cut. Then I'm going to back my ruler up to 10 inches. I'm keeping a straight line on my long edge to keep everything straight. 10 inches. And then I back it up to 7.5. And again, lines on the straight edges to keep it all straight. 10.5. Then 5. And finally 2.5 inches. From my red strip, I need 4 2.5-inch squares. So again, clean cut your first 2 edges. And then if we're getting 4 2.5-inch squares, that would mean we need a 2.5 by 10-inch strip. So 2.5 on the long edge that we just cut, 10 on the short edge we just cut. Back the ruler up to 7.5, keeping lines on our long straight edges. Five is our next measurement to back up to, and 2.5. From my blue strips, I need 9 1-inch squares, and I'm going to cut all of mine at once. In fact, I already cut 2 sides so you didn't have to watch me flip the mat around. So since they're 9 1-inch squares, that means I need a 1-inch wide strip by 9 inches long. Then I just back up in 1-inch increments. I go back to 8. Seven. 6. 5. 4. 3. 2. And 1. So now I have 36 1-inch blue squares. On the wrong side of each of those 36 1-inch squares, we're going to mark 1 line diagonal from point to point. You can use any straight edge, it doesn't matter, and I'm using a mechanical pencil to mark, but anything that'll give you a fine line is okay. So I have divided my 1-inch squares into piles by each fabric. Now we're going to take our 2.5-inch squares, and it doesn't matter, pick a corner, but let's try to keep it consistent. And we're going to take on the same corner on all 9 of these. So if you're starting with your upper left-hand corner, then do all your upper left-hand corner. Whichever print you want in that corner, we're going to use the same one in all the upper left-hand corners. So we're going to line it up, raw edges together, or our little square, wrong sides together. That's raw edges matching wrong sides together. And we're going to stitch, not exactly on that line, but like a stitch length, stitch width over into the seam allowance, which is the part towards the corner. We're going to stitch right next to that line. By stitching just to the edge of it rather than right on it, it gives us room for the fabric to turn on itself and still go all the way to the edge. So here's my 2.5 inch squares with the first 1 inch square sewn to the edge. I do check to make sure it's going to fold to the edge. If I'm satisfied, then keep sewing. You don't want to have to sew them all and then tear them out if it's not. Now we're just going to take another stack of 1 inch blue and put them on a different corner. You can pick any corner. I'm going to pick just the opposite corner because that's going to be the easiest for me to keep track of right now. And do the same thing. We're sewing towards the corner just like a stitch width over from the line, and sew all those little 1 inch squares onto our 2.5 inch squares. Okay, I have my 1 inch squares sewn on 2 corners. And now I'm just going to grab my next stack, and it doesn't matter which corner, sew it onto the next one. I'm just going to try to keep them all exactly the same. And then finally I will sew the last stack onto the last corner. You may notice I haven't pressed yet. I'm going to save them to press all of them at once. Once I have squares sewn onto all 4 corners of all of my 2.5 inch squares, I'm going to come back and trim off those corners. Make sure before you trim that they're how you want them. I will admit I usually, on this kind of sewing, like to press first and then trim. And that's what I started to do on here, but there's 2 different pressing directions. So trimming afterwards makes it a little more awkward on one of them. So we're going to just trim off, leaving a 1/4 inch seam allowance. We're trimming off that outside corner. And once you've done that, then on the octagons with the white center, we are going to press away from the center toward the blue. But on the ones that are the red centers, we are pressing in toward the center, toward the red. Once all of your hexagons are trimmed and pressed, now it's just time to put them together into a 9 patch. And I am trying to keep them all oriented the same way, so I have the same blue in the upper left hand corner and the lower right hand corner and so on and so forth. If for some reason you messed up, it would not be the end of the world. It's just if you do keep them all oriented the same, then anywhere that 4 corners come in together, all 4 blues are going to be in there. So once you have them laid out, then we're going to sew them together in rows. So this is a row, this is a row, and this is a row. My rows are sewn together, and once they're sewn together, my top and bottom row, I'm pressing the seams away from this, not away, into the center, so toward the red, and my middle row, I'm pressing away from the center, also toward the red. Now my last step is to put my rows together. I'm going to be matching here and here, but these seams are also going opposite directions just like they were in the last step, so they should nest as well. Here's my finished octagon block. When I sewed the rows together, my last 2 seams are pressed open to take care of the bulk. I will say I consider this block to be kind of fussy to put together. It's because of those 1 inch squares. It's not hard or impossible. You just need to slow down and take your time. The next block is the quartered star, or the Q block. There are 4 pieces of fabric for this block, and I did change the colors around a little bit. Our first piece on our list is our beige rectangle. Our second piece says it's a purple floral square. Ours is not purple, it's a navy background. And then the next piece says it's a purple strip. You do not have a purple strip, you have this kind of drab greenish brown strip. And finally we have the dark pink strip. The beige strip or rectangle, we're cutting into 4 rectangles that are 2.5 by 4.5. So 2.5 times 4 is 10. And then we go 4.5 on the other direction across. So 4.5 by 10 would be the rectangle to cut it to and then cut down from. Once we have our 4.5 by 10 inch rectangle, we're going to back off to 7.5. Then 5. And as usual, I'm lining up lines along my long edge as well to keep everything straight. And finally 2.5. My square for the center, I'm going to cut down to a 2.5 inch square. So it's pretty straightforward, straighten 2 edges. Rotate and line up 2.5 on both sides. Okay, for my strip that the pattern is calling dark purple, which is more of a greenish brown, and my pink strip, I'm cutting 4 2.5 inch squares. I'm going to cut mine all at once, so I have just stacked them up. So 2.5 times 4 is 10. I'm going to be bad and rotate this. You can pick up your mat. So I need it 2.5 inches wide by 10 inches long. Go back to 7.5. Five. And 2.5. On the wrong side of all of the pink and what the pattern is calling purple, but we have brownish green squares, we're going to mark one line diagonal from corner to corner. So like that. Then we're going to take our 4 beige rectangles, and let's start, doesn't really matter, start with one, but I'm going to start with the pink. And we're going to put it on one end of our rectangle so that our line goes from the bottom right hand corner up toward the center of our rectangle. And then we're going to take it to the sewing machine and stitch, and you want just about a thread's width inside that line. And when I say inside, it's out toward the outside corner, the top corner, not in towards the center of the block. We're going to stitch all 4 of those exactly like that. The squares are stitched on, and I do check to make sure that my pink is going to go all the way to the edge. When you're satisfied with it, you can trim off to the 1/4 inch and then press, or you can press first and then trim off to the 1/4 inch. Completely up to you. But it's just like we've done before. And I won't show you all of them. My next step is to take my other colored triangle, which in our case is a brownish green, and we're going to put it on so that our lines run parallel. We're not making flying geese units. We're actually making units that look like this. So I want my line to go into the upper left hand corner and then down toward the middle of the beige block. And again, I'm going to sew about a stitch width or a thread width inside the seam allowance, which is out toward the outside corner. And I'm going to do that on all 4. All right, I've sewn my brownish green square to the opposite side so that it looks like this. Do check to make sure it's going to go all the way to the edge. You can press it before trimming or trim first and then press after, whichever you want to do. So we're going to trim them off so that they're like that. So all 4 rectangles look exactly like that. Okay, now we want to put our block together so that it looks like this. If you wanted to, you could certainly switch it so that your star points were pink. It wouldn't make any difference. You just need to pay attention to which way you're going. Okay, so This is going together a little different than most of our blocks have. I don't think we've ever done a partial seam before. So we're going to take our square and put it on top of the rectangle, and we're going to sew a partial seam. So from the edge to about the halfway point. Don't sew it all the way in. So let me go do it, and it might be easier to see after I've done it. Okay, so this is my partial seam. You see it's not sewn on the last half. It is sewn over here. I did press just the edge of the seam up here, so it might be easier to see the stitching there. I did take one little back stitch there because I don't want it pulling out. I don't want a big glob of thread there, so just one quick stitch. Now my next piece goes on here, and this one now can sew from end to end. So I'm just going to go here and sew that rectangle onto that side. Okay, my first seam is still a partial, but this one is sewn all the way, and I pressed toward the outside, and I'm just going to add my next rectangle on the same way. This one gets stitched from end to end. Okay, I added this one on. Again, I pressed out away from the center. And now we're going to add our last rectangle. We just want to fold this piece with the partial seam out of the way, and we're going to sew this one on end to end again. That side's on, so now all I have to do is finish the seam that was a partial to start with. Now, this was a little small in the middle, so when you go to stitch here, make sure you're not catching a fold or anything. But I'm just going to start, and I'll overlap my stitches a couple stitches and stitch out to the end. Here's the finished quartered star. I did press all the seams out away from the center. So now you know how to do a partial seam. It's very handy when you have something like this that's going around a center. For the Zig Zag Block, you have two rectangles. One is a teal print, and the other one the pattern says is purple. It is not, it is brown. The Zig Zag Block is actually made up of 8 flying geese units. We're going to be cutting exactly the same pieces from both our teal and our brown, so I have mine stacked on top of each other. I'm going to straighten one edge. My rulers that I have handy right now aren't big enough to do 2, so I'll line up a line with what I just straightened and cut. And I am going to use the wing clipper, but the measurements in the pattern are actually bigger than what the wing clipper calls for. So I'm going to go ahead and cut them that size, because that just means I have a little more to trim off later. So my biggest square that I want to cut out of these is 4 3/4, and I'm going to cut that one off first so that I don't mess up and make something too small. So I'm going to go 4 3/4, cut it off. And I have one more side still to go, so 4 3/4 there. So that's my 2 big squares for my flying geese. And then out of the rest of it, I need 4 2 5/8 inch squares. So that's 4 5 1/4 inches. A 5 1/4 inch square. So I'm lining my 5 1/4 up on 2 cut edges. And then I'm going to move back to 2 5/8 this way, and 2 5/8 the other way, and if I don't move them, I can cut them. And that gives me my 4 small squares of each color. On the wrong side of all the small squares, we're going to mark either one line, point to point, and then sew 1/4 inch away from that line on both sides, or if you're using the magic wand, line up the scored line with your points and then mark on both sides, and in that case you will sew on the line. We're going to be making 2 different sets of flying geese. So on the large teal square, we're going to put the small brown squares, going point to point, And if you will nudge it in about 1/16 of an inch, or just so a little bit is showing on the edges, then that gives you a little better than 1/4 of an inch on the inside point to trim at the end. And then with the large brown, we're going to use the small teal squares. We have done this several times before, so it should be familiar. And we're going to take it to the sewing machine. If you marked one line, then you're going to sew 1/4 of an inch away from that line. If you marked 2 lines, you're going to sew on the line. Okay, I have stitched my first squares onto the big squares. I'm going to cut it in half between the stitching lines. I'm going to do the same thing on both units, and we're going to press toward the small triangles. So now we have pieces that look like this. On the one that has the large brown rectangle, or there's 2 of them, we're going to take our small teal square. Again, we're bumping it in about 1/16 of an inch from the edge. On our large teal triangle, we're going to put the small brown square, and we're going to do the same thing on all 4 of these units. Now we have 4 units that look like this, and we're going to cut them in half between the stitching lines and press toward the small triangles again. Now we have 8 flying geese units, and they need to be trimmed down to 3.5 wide by 2 inches high. If you do not have the wing clipper, then you can use a regular ruler. Half of 3.5 is 1 3/4, so I would line my 1 3/4 mark right here up and the 1/4 inch mark with that point, and I'm going to be trimming it to 2 inches, so I really want to swing it around so my 2 inch marks are running into my seam allowances here. Then I would trim here and here, and then I would go ahead and trim down the other side so it's 3.5 by 2.5. If you have the wing clipper, it's going to be this mark that is right here between the 1.5 and the 2.5. I'm going to line that mark up with my point on the top, and my 2 inch mark here and here should be going into my seam allowances. And actually it will work better if I do this for the way I cut. Okay, you have it lined up. You're going to cut your first 2 edges. And then we're going to rotate. We have the 3.5 inch mark here and the 2 inch mark down here. I'm going to line that up, and my diagonal line should go right down this seam allowance. My crosshatch there should be in the point, and the lines here should also be running on my seam allowance. And trim. So let me do one more of those. Try the other colorway, see if it makes any difference. I'll line up that mark up in the point. I'm lining up my 2 inch marks down here running into the seam allowance to get this as straight as I possibly can. And this one isn't a high contrast, so it's a little harder to see. I'm going to rotate my 3.5 inch mark over here, my 2 inch mark down here, my diagonal line sitting in the seam allowance. There should be one here as well. And trim. So I'm going to trim all 8 of them to the same size. Once all our flying geese units are trimmed down, we're going to sew them together into pairs. And you're going to need to decide whether you want your zigzag to be brown or whether you want it to be the teal, because how you sew them together in pairs determines which part will be the zigzag. That's the part in the center. So whichever one you want to be the zigzag, put that color on top on the triangle, and then the smaller triangles on the bottom. And when I sew these together, I'm going to sew them like this so that I can see that point. Sorry, I'm moving off the so I can see this point right here and sew through it. So again, if I wanted brown to be my zigzag, then the triangle, the big triangle is going to go on the top, the small one's going to go on the bottom. If I wanted blue, it would be just the opposite, and they're all going to get sewn together the same way. After sewing our pairs together to make squares, we're going to press 2 squares with the seam going down and 2 with the seam going up. And now we're going to put them together in a row. So you want to alternate the down, up, and sew them together. Doesn't really matter which one's on top, because in both cases you have this point right here that you really want to match. Once all our squares are sewn together, we're going to press those seams open, and that finishes our zigzag block.